Good evening, I'm Ian Hannamansing, and this is a special edition of The National. Tonight we're tracking breaking news, another stunning development in a story that has shaken this country and many other countries around the world. The crash of Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752. Iran admitting late tonight it is responsible for shooting the plane out of the sky shortly after takeoff in Tehran, killing 176 people on board, and that included 57 Canadians. State media broadcasting a statement from the military saying the plane was mistaken for a hostile target after it turned towards a sensitive military center. The military said it was at its highest level of readiness because of the heightened tensions with the United States. The statement said the military apologized for the disaster and said it would upgrade its systems to prevent future tragedies. It also said those responsible for this missile strike will be prosecuted. The Iranian president tweeting his own remorse. The Islamic Republic of Iran deeply regrets this disastrous mistake, he said. My thoughts and prayers go to all the mourning families, and I offer my sincerest condolences. Well, we have a team of reporters who are standing by live for you tonight covering this breaking news. They are in Washington, Kiev, Ottawa, but let's begin in the region. Margaret Evans is in Beirut for us tonight. And Margaret, one of the things we're asking ourselves and looking for your insights on this, why do you think such a dramatic reversal from the Iranian government?
Well, Ian, I think that the evidence was simply becoming too great. You saw this universal questioning of the story that the Iranians were putting forth. Yesterday, we saw an emergency meeting of the European Union foreign ministers, the NATO Secretary General coming out saying he had no reason to disbelieve the intelligence that he was hearing from various allied capitals. And I think that at that stage, it became very, very difficult for the Iranians to hold this line, especially with the intelligence gathering tools that the world has these days. But as you've said, it is really an about face. I mean, less than 24 hours ago, the Iranian government had dispatched the head of its aviation authority to insist that it couldn't speculate, but the one thing it could say was that it absolutely was assured that a missile could not have shot down this plane. And this is going to cause problems for the Iranian government in Iran. You can count on that because they will have exposed themselves, in a sense, in a lie to their own public. But they will be saying, and have been saying as well, you're going to see this coming ahead, this line that one of the reasons that this happened was because Iran was in such a state of high tension, given the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the state of war that they saw themselves in with the Americans.
We have just about 30 seconds left with you. I want to ask you this, though. Knowing what you know about the politics of that region, what would a possible motive be for the Iranian government to make this kind of statement? Are they playing to their own country? Are they playing to the rest of the world?
I certainly don't think they're playing to their own country. I think they would have liked to continue the line that they were having, and we saw all of the indications of those kind of tools they have to control the message being employed. You know, we saw from colleagues on the ground in Iran the very quick bulldozing, if you like, of the crash site, all of that, initially saying they weren't going to hand over those black boxes, but they did allow Ukrainian investigators in, and we did see yesterday the Ukrainian foreign minister saying that he was satisfied that progress was coming. Again, I just think that the overwhelming evidence was probably too great for them to carry on with any kind of plausible deniability.
All right, Margaret, thank you very much. Let's go from Beirut now to Kiev. Chris Brown joins us once again. Still not quite dawn yet in Ukraine, and no official reaction yet from the government at this early hour, Chris.
No, it's not, but when everyone went to bed last night, Ukraine was maintaining its almost middle-of-the-road position. Unlike Canada, the United States, Britain, and other Western powers, it was not suggesting that it was a missile that brought this down. As Margaret mentioned, there are 45, 50 Ukrainian investigators on the ground at the crash site. And it did appear that the President Vladimir Zelensky and the foreign minister were trying to keep some sort of opening, if you will, for the Iranians to at least make some kind of announcement like this on their own. That was the first thing that struck me. Was I did wonder whether they had some hint that this was coming, and they almost didn't want to jump in too soon. One interesting thing, though, that was said last night in the news conference was about the plane and its position and whether or not it was where it should have been. The foreign minister was asked, was it proper for that aircraft, given these heightened tensions, to be where it was, to even be flying in and out of Tehran? And his answer was that they had inspected the flight path already, and in their estimation, in their opinion, the plane was doing exactly what it should have done. There is a well-traveled flight corridor coming in and out of Tehran, and the foreign minister said the plane was where it should have been. So that does contradict, to a large degree, the Iranian assertion that the plane had made a turn and had veered off course. That's not what the Ukrainian investigators are saying at this point, at least, Ian.
Yeah, and really, to be blunt, every step of the way from the Iranian government, we've had misstatements. The night, for example, it was morning in Iran of the crash. They, on state television, said it was mechanical problems. Just a few hours ago, they defiantly said it was not a missile. And so this news story, though it is accepting responsibility and apologizing, this news story about the plane strangely heading towards what appeared to be a sensitive military target, and that is what led to the missile being set off. Who knows? We have no way, I guess, of evaluating if that's true or not. Give us a bit of insight into the relationship between Ukraine and Iran and what impact this apology and this admission might have on that relationship.
Well, it does seem to me that Vladimir Zelensky has found himself in a lot of tight spots over the last 6 months, needless to say, at the center of the U.S. Impeachment debate, and now this one with a need to get answers and to have a legitimate investigation with a country that most Western nations have very little diplomatic ties with and very lousy relations overall. And yet Zelensky was perhaps better placed than many others. Of course, Ukrainian International Airlines was flying into Tehran. It was a well-traveled route, obviously, not just for Ukrainians. But it was a Ukrainian plane. There were 11 Ukrainians on that plane, including 9 crew members. So Ukraine obviously had a huge stake, has a huge stake in getting answers. And it seemed to me, as this last few days have progressed, Zelensky was very keen to try not to criticize too harshly the Iranians or their investigation team, trying to keep all the lines of communications open. And given today's announcement, it would seem he kind of probably played that fairly correct. Now, last night the foreign minister was not especially critical of what had happened so far on the ground. He had said that his teams had been given access to the crash site. He was asked about parts being bulldozed and so forth. He didn't say that had happened. He said from their point of view, the investigation was going and that Iran was cooperating, even if it was slower than what they would have liked, and even if there were some elements of the plane they hadn't seen yet. And he particularly pointed out passenger seats, for example, and they haven't examined the bodies and so forth. But this was the fine line that Ukraine was trying to pursue, and we'll see this morning, once everyone wakes up here, exactly what the Ukrainian reaction is. We were supposed to also hear from Ukrainian International Airlines. They are to have an event, a news conference later on this morning, so there'll be a lot of comments obviously coming out of here once the sun's up. Ian.
Yeah, 7 o'clock hour, I think, in Kyiv right now. Chris, you got a busy day ahead of you, and thank you very much for the update. We're coming up to 10 after 10 Mountain Time here as we're live on the National. Let's go to Ottawa now. David Cochran working the late night phones there. And David, you wonder how much this story was pushed forward and what pressure might have been put on the Iranian government by Canada's head of government when Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday made that announcement saying that this country, among others, believed that a missile from Iran brought down this plane. Talk a little bit about how Canada, from an Ottawa perspective, has been framing this story.
Yeah, Ian, the Prime Minister made it pretty clear at his news conference on Thursday that Canada believed quite clearly what happened in this incident. What they were wondering is how it happened and why it happened. Because the Prime Minister, for him to come to the National Press Theatre and say that with confidence that he believed the sources from the information and intelligence from their intelligence partners and also from Canada's own sources, that an Iranian missile shot down this plane, he said the evidence suggests that, though he did give them the out of saying that it might have been accidental. Well, that was a remarkable statement for the head of the Canadian government to say that in public. But what was interesting throughout it all, Ian, is that even while he outlined what he thought had happened, Justin Trudeau was very clear to avoid assigning any kind of substantial blame. When asked about whether he blamed the Americans for escalating tensions in the regions or the Iranians for what had happened, obviously them having the direct cause of this, he said it wouldn't be helpful at this point in time because Canada has been really trying to get into the country as best they can to provide consular services for people who are affected and to participate in the investigation. And for that to happen, they need the cooperation of a nation that, quite frankly, is culpable in what has happened through the admission of the Iranian government. So their focus has been on accountability, openness, transparency, and justice, and getting answers. This is what they were pushing for, trying to get visas, trying to get 10 consular officials into the country, trying to get 2 Transportation Safety Board officials into the country with varying degrees of success, while keeping up pressure with the Foreign Minister, Francois-Philippe Champagne, saying tonight, the world is watching Iran. Well, the world is certainly watching Iran right now. I'm not sure anybody in the Canadian government tonight was quite expecting an admission of responsibility like the one we've now gotten.
Yeah, just seconds left here, David, but it's already early Saturday morning in Ottawa, just after midnight. I don't know, does the PMO answer phone calls at this time of night?
Not from me at this particular moment. I've been trying to get people in the Prime Minister's office, also in Minister Champagne's office. Emails have been sent out. Nobody has gotten back at this point. The minute I get something, Ian, you're going to be the first person to know.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, David Cochran in Ottawa. Let's go to Washington now. Another of our reporters standing by live for us, Susan Ormiston. Susan, just a moment ago from David, we heard about the careful kind of diplomatic stance of Canada in this story, and interesting to look at the statement from the Iranian government here in terms of the diplomacy. Yes, accepting responsibility. Yes, apologizing, but also perhaps, well, not perhaps, pretty clearly putting a little bit of that blame towards the United States as well.
Yes, I would say putting a lot of the blame for the circumstances which led up to this tragic, unforeseen incident. They are saying that, going back in their statement, they say that hours after the U.S. military was attacked in Iraq by Iranian missiles, let's not forget that there was increased U.S. military flight activity around Iran's borders. So they were watching this, and there was heightened radar activity. So clearly, the country was anticipating a possible strike back, and the world was too early on Wednesday morning. So they were waiting for that. Obviously, their radar systems were on high alert, and they say that it was human error, of course, that kicked off a missile to an aircraft that was misidentified coming towards them. But the foreign minister says it was partly caused by U.S. adventurism. Of course, Washington, the White House will deeply debate that. Now, Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, said he was deeply regretted this disastrous mistake. He also said it was an unforgivable mistake, which I thought was interesting language for him at this stage. So that's what's coming out in the early hours in Iran this morning.
Yeah, and also the reference that the people responsible will be prosecuted. That seemed to go maybe a step further than they absolutely had to if they just wanted to accept responsibility and acknowledge what's been said by many people around the world, including the Canadian Prime Minister. And speaking of heads of government, Donald Trump has been tweeting.
Yes, unusually, he a few minutes ago retweeted a sample of what he said in his public statement about this whole incident this week. He said, "Iran, on my watch, will never have a nuclear weapon." He retweeted that part of the news conference when he came out and gave that statement. And then he retweeted someone else's tweet about Soleimani being a terrorist and a thug. And those are the two tweets that we've heard. Gosh, it's after midnight here. From the President of the United States. He hasn't tweeted anything else since.
Really nice getting your perspective, Susan, as well as your colleagues. And we've been talking to all of you live this hour here on The National. Thank you very much. The enormity of this tragedy for many still sinking in. These are just some of the people who were on that flight. They were flying to Canada to study, to work, to reunite with loved ones, and from coast to coast today, they were remembered.
We're all in this together. We're all human beings, and we're going to have each other's backs.
Students and staff gathered at York University in Toronto to remember 3 students. Similar scenes on campuses across the country. So many young people among the dead. The University of Windsor paying tribute to 5 victims.
We don't often think how events so far can hit so close to home. And yet here we are.
And at the University of Manitoba, they paused to remember 8 people.
It's a loss for the world and a future that could have been.
In Calgary tonight, people bundling up to light candles and lay flowers, many of them high school students honoring a lost friend.
This is something I could never imagine, coming here for my friend at such a young age, like age 19. You know, like, we were all waiting for him to arrive and be here with us today, but, you know, it's just crazy that we have to be here.
On top of the heart-wrenching grief and horrible circumstances, there are other practical issues as well. As the CBC's Karen Pauls tells us, those challenges only deepen the pain for victims' families.
Just days after the deadly crash, victims' families had to face their fears and board airplanes.
So right now, the most important thing for all of us is to just go to Iran to identify the bodies and then attending the funeral.
Javad Soleimani and Ali Reza Ganji met on the flight from Toronto to Frankfurt. Soleimani's wife, Alnaz Nabii, died in the crash. Ganji lost his wife, Faiza Falsafi, his daughter, who would have turned 18 tomorrow, and his 8-year-old son.
We are waiting to understand what's happened.
The 2 men are stuck in Frankfurt, waiting for their airline to resume flights to Tehran. Paul Jaroge knows exactly how they feel. His family was killed in the crash of a Boeing MAX 8 in Ethiopia last March.
You're lost. The void, the solitude, the imagination of your loved one last moments.
One of the stresses, the time it will take to get the remains. Islam calls for burial as soon as possible, but for the families of Flight 752, that could take months.
So it's important they get to the crash site. It also helps you to know that it's going to be a long process.
Some of the victims didn't have family in Canada, leaving their friends to deal with their homes and belongings here. Saeed Gavami's friend Farouk Khadam was a talented immunology researcher in Winnipeg.
She is a fantastic woman and a role model for scientific society.
Her parents in Iran are signing legal documents, giving Gavami authority to wrap up her estate. Back in the Frankfurt airport, the shock is starting to wear off, replaced by indescribable grief.
In just 1 second, I lost all of my life.
And I don't know how can I continue my life.
Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
We have more breaking news coverage ahead for you. The National continues right after this. Let's take you back to our breaking news this hour. Iran claiming responsibility tonight for shooting down Flight 752. In a statement read out on Iranian state television, the country's military says human error caused the downing of Boeing 737-800 aircraft. 176 people were on board. Everyone was killed, and 57 of those passengers were Canadians. 138 people were bound for Canada. While Iran has changed its position on what caused the crash, we don't know whether it will do the same in terms of making it easier for countries like Canada to be involved in the investigation. Before this big announcement, Canada had its own plan, a new plan to increase pressure on Iran to grant investigators access. Ashley Burke has that story.
Canada has pushed for access since day one. Now it has reinforcements.
This group brings together representatives of Ukraine, Sweden, Afghanistan, and the United Kingdom, who are all grieving and also searching for answers.
Countries who lost citizens now forming an international response group, one voice to put pressure on Iran.
We want full accountability. We want answers to these questions, and the world is watching what the Iranian government is doing now.
What they want is to be part of the investigation, to make sure it's transparent and thorough. So far, Iran hasn't granted that. But under international requirements, Canada is allowed to visit the crash site and receive updates on the case.
Every country that does an investigation needs other countries to help, other resources to help. There's no doubt about it. And they need people, expertise. They need the people that know the information about the operation, about the aircraft, to come and help them.
2 Transportation Safety Board investigators are in Turkey waiting for visas. But by the time they get to Tehran, there may not be much of a scene left.
That's not the normal way of handling it all. It's very shoddy work. And the integrity of the crash site is very important for so many reasons. You map where you get the wreckage from to see how the airplane broke up.
When a missile brought down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, investigators reconstructed the plane piece by piece, searching for definitive proof of what brought it down. That's the next step for investigators in Iran.
There's a lot of pieces. You can see the wreckage is all broken up. Identifying the pieces, difficult sometimes, takes a lot of work, has to be done systematically, and takes a long time.
The 2 Canadians granted visas so far are consular officials responsible for helping families and identifying victims. But 10 more Canadian officials still want in. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
So a lot of concern about how the crash site is being treated and what condition it's in, but maintaining its integrity may be difficult given how big the area is. The media has had limited access because of how challenging it is for them to enter Iran. CBS's Elizabeth Palmer is one of the few Western journalists there, and here's what she saw today.
We've arrived at what the local people say is the crash site. There are no guards here. Nobody tried to stop us coming in. In fact, there are people all over, some looking for things of value to take away, some just reflecting on what's happened. There isn't much of the plane left. Local people say that trucks, cranes showed up and took most of the pieces that were here away. Clearly, this is an impact crater behind me, another one over there, but they're empty. At the moment, it doesn't appear that the Ukrainian investigators have come to the site, and whatever evidence was here is just not here anymore.
You're watching a special edition of The National. We're following a major breaking story on Flight 752. We'll be back right after this. We're following major breaking news tonight. The Iranian government taking responsibility for shooting down the Ukrainian jetliner, blaming, quote, human error. Military officials saying the plane was mistaken for a hostile target and was unintentionally shot down. The announcement reverses Iran's original claim that mechanical issues caused the deadly crash. As the families of the victims struggle to get into Iran, they're left wondering why Flight 752 was allowed to fly at all, as the tensions between the U.S. and Iran seem to boil over. Susan Ormiston went looking for the answer.
Tuesday night. After Iranian missiles aimed at Americans, President Trump huddled in the Situation Room tweeted, "All's well." But at that very moment, Flight 752 was flaming to the ground, hit by a different Iranian missile. With Iran on high alert, why was that passenger jet even flying? It wasn't the only one. A dozen commercial flights flew in, mostly out of Tehran early that morning. Lufthansa, Qatar Airways, Turkish Airlines all made it. Ukrainian Airlines didn't.
I think it would have been wise for everyone to stay out of that airspace.
And
it's
why?
Just too unpredictable right now. It's too volatile.
But why do you think they didn't?
You don't feel that the risk is there to change your operation. It changes flight times, it changes fuel, and in some cases it limits the number of people they can carry on board. So there are significant operational ramifications.
Ukraine's foreign minister said Flight 752 was flying in a designated safe corridor. But Iran could have, and many argue should have, closed its airspace.
It's the responsibility of the government that owns the airspace to let everyone know if there is a change in the safety conditions within that airspace, if there's a potential for hostilities, if there's military action, anything like that.
Also, national regulators could have issued air advisories. The U.S. did. 2 NOTAMs, notice to airmen, hours before, forbidding U.S. aircraft or pilots from flying over Iraq or Iran. Tragically, these same questions raged after MH17 was shot down by a Russian Buk missile over Ukraine. And tonight, other world airlines are skirting Iran and Iraq. Europe has issued an advisory. No Canadian airlines fly direct, but Transport Canada has formalized its warning with a NOTAM, advising operators to stay clear. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Washington.
You're watching a special edition of The National as we follow the major breaking news on Flight 752 developing just in the last hour or so. Iran, as you can see on your screen, admitting responsibility for launching a missile. They say it was unintentional. They say the people responsible will be prosecuted, but they do admit the Iranian military launching a missile that brought down the Ukrainian jet. We'll be right back. We continue to follow some breaking news this hour. Iran now admitting responsibility for firing a missile at Flight 752. In a statement on Iranian state television, the country's military says human error caused the downing of the Boeing 737. 176 people were on board. Everyone was killed, and 57 of those passengers were Canadian, and a total of 138 were bound for this country. Throughout the week in this story, we have been collecting questions from many of you, and earlier tonight we had some experts answer them. Of course, this was recorded before the major breaking news that we've been telling you about this hour, that Iran has taken responsibility for shooting down the airplane. Turning back to our top story tonight, the downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 outside Tehran. There are still so many more questions than answers. As families grieve, the search for those answers continues, not just from investigators or officials, but also from many of you. So many viewers have sent in thoughtful questions, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can with our panel here tonight. Janice Stein of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy is in our Toronto studio. Saeed Khan, a Middle East expert, is with Wayne State University. He's in Detroit tonight. And from Ottawa, Larry Vance, a former investigator with the Transportation Safety Board. Glad to have all three of you with us. Our first viewer question comes from Khalil Jafari, and he asks, and a lot of people actually asked a similar question, how could Iran allow civil aviation while they're attacking other countries? Larry, let's start with you on that.
Well, they're supposed to shut the airspace down if there's a perceived threat from military operations. That's how it's supposed to work. There's no central agency, though, in the world that says we're going to keep an eye on all of this and tell everybody, all the airlines flying all around the world, to in fact, don't go there. So it was up to Iran has control of the airspace. Iran should have shut their airspace down. There are protocols through ICAO that airlines and countries are supposed to use, but the international community is full of protocols and they're not mandatory. Something went wrong here. The Ukrainians should have been informed that the airspace was dangerous, and Iran should have shut it down. That's how it should have worked.
Janice, knowing what you do about this part of the world, were you surprised that there were commercial jetliners flying that morning?
I actually was, Ian, because the airspace previously had been closed over the Gulf. So it was surprising to me that the airspace around the major civilian airport would be open. However, what we do know is governments are always enormously reluctant to shut down their civilian airport. It's a signal of vulnerability to everybody else, and they go to great lengths to keep that civilian airspace open. This was a tragic mistake here.
And as Larry points out, I mean, the airlines also make their individual decisions, talking to people like you, right, to assess the risk, and Ukrainian Airlines decided to go ahead. Let's go on to our next question now. Brian McEwen wrote us to ask, Iran said that they would target the United States and their allies, so he's wondering why there has not been more discussion about whether this was intentional. After all, Canada is a U.S. ally. Saeed?
Well, Canada is a U.S. ally, but the aircraft was actually Ukrainian, not an adversary to Iran, and not one that would be considered to be a U.S. ally as far as the coalition forces in the region goes. The second thing, of course, is the reason why the intentional possibility doesn't really factor in is because there really hasn't been anything conclusive to prove that Iran was trying to down this plane. In fact, just a few hours ago, the Ukrainian foreign minister simply said that it's too soon to draw any conclusions about this and is seeking to have full disclosure of the investigation before coming to some kind of a judgment on it.
Yeah, so I guess one question is, we may get to this, is whether it's a missile at all. But even if it is a missile, we heard from the United States, from the Prime Minister of Canada, from others, that it was likely unintentional. Let's go on to our next question. Michael Varus wrote us to ask, what actions will Canada take if the theory of the missile downing the aircraft proved to be true? Janice?
Well, I think the really crucial distinction here, Ian, was it deliberate or was it intentional? Or was it accidental? There's absolutely no action that our government will take if this was a tragic mistake. And I think that's the overwhelmingly likely event. For this to be an intentional attack, it would be unprecedented for a country to shoot down a civilian aircraft in its own airport. There is no precedent for that. So I think this is accidental, and if this is an accidental mistake, our government will not take any action, nor will any other government take action.
But Janice, help us understand, how could it be accidental? How would that come about?
It could have been accidental because an operator who was manning the batteries around the airport misread that aircraft, thought it was a military aircraft rather than a civilian aircraft, fired a missile to take down what they thought was a threat. The United States did that. It's, you know, it shot down an Iranian civilian aircraft when one of its operators made exactly the same kind of misjudgment. Humans make errors all the time.
And Larry, based on what you know about investigating air crashes, does the missile theory seem to be a plausible, likely one to you?
Absolutely, it does. Ian, what happened to the airplane that we see in the video, provided that's validated, we see a missile hitting an airplane. We know that the airplane was disabled almost instantaneously. There's very, very few, probably no, mechanical issues on the airplane that I can think of, or that anybody that I talk to can think of, that would disable an airplane that quickly and cause the airplane to take the flight profile that it did.
Let's go back to viewer questions now. Jennifer and Mark Halleck would like to know, why were there so many Canadians on the flight, so many people connected to Canada? Saeed?
Well, Ukrainian International Airlines is actually one of the few, if any others exist, airlines that has a very simple flight plan to Canada. From Tehran, there's one stop at the hub in Kyiv, and then from there it's a nonstop flight to Toronto. So for those who are looking at perhaps the shortest distance, the shortest connection time from one point to the other, this would definitely be the ideal flight for them.
And we also had a lot of international students, Ian, students from Iran studying in Canada, many of them dual citizens, who'd gone home to Iran for the holiday break between semesters. That's why we had such extraordinary losses in the universities across the country.
Next question comes from Peter Rowley in Toronto. He'd like to know if there's any precedent for a country like Iran to be successfully sued for damages if, in fact, this was a missile that brought down the plane. Larry, we touched on this a bit already, but what's your view of that?
Yeah, there's not a lot of guidance in that area. There are a couple of occurrences from the past. One has already been mentioned. The United States shot down an Iranian aircraft back in the late 1980s. And what happened after that was that Iran sued the United States, and the United States ended up paying tens of millions of dollars to the passengers who were aboard that aircraft. The other one is the Malaysian Air Flight 17 that was shot down over the Ukraine, in fact, 4 or 5 years ago. And what happened there was that the passengers were compensated by the airline, by Malaysian Air, and I don't know the amounts, but I know that they were compensated for that.
You know, this whole story began really as an aviation story, and now it's turning maybe into a political relations, international relations story, and that leads us to a question from Cesar Cano, who says, can or should the Canadian government adopt a tougher position against Iran? And he also asks about options around, for example, implementing more sanctions. Saeed?
Well, if this is an accident, then it seems unwise and perhaps inappropriate to go ahead and seek some kind of tougher and even punitive measures. As terrible as this is, an accident it may be. If, on the other hand, it is proven to be an intentional act, and again, we simply don't know, there's no indication that it would be seen as an intentional act, well, then the Canadian government has to really decide whether it is sufficient to then press for perhaps more diplomatic isolation of Iran, press for more sanctions. But again, as both Larry and Janice have indicated, the current circumstances probably don't call for the Canadian government to really have too many options in that direction.
I really appreciate hearing all of you address these questions and providing the best answers we can at this point. And for those of you at home watching this, please sending in questions. This story certainly will merit more investigation. I have to tell you that some of the questions we got we're digging into because they don't lend themselves to easy answers as we continue to wonder what exactly led to this tragedy. So impressive answers from that panel, especially when you consider we did it before the major development late tonight. We now know for sure what brought down the plane. Iran admitting it shot the plane down with a missile, claims it was a mistake. We'll have more after the break on this special edition of The National.
You.
This is Iranian State Television broadcasting early Saturday morning in Iran, late tonight in Canada. A statement from the military. It said Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 was mistaken for a hostile target and shot down shortly after takeoff from Tehran. All 176 people on board were killed, among them 57 Americans. Many more were en route to this country. There were Canadians aboard the plane. Tonight's admission is another devastating detail in a tragedy that has deeply affected communities from coast to coast to coast. David Cochrane is in Ottawa, and he has more reaction to this breaking news tonight. So, David, so many Canadians on this plane, so many more who are headed to this country, many of them studying in universities. And so both the Canadian government and families of people who died in that crash trying to get into Iran, first of all, and once they get there, trying to either investigate or, if it's the case of families, find out more about what happened. What are some of the challenges they're going to face?
Yeah, there have been really a couple of tracks in Canada's approach to this. There has been the ongoing and loud call for a clear and transparent investigation to find out how and why this happened. Well, we now have the admission of wrongdoing from Iran, so I'm not sure that settles a big question. I don't know if it settles all of the questions, but the second track has been to just get into the country. The former Harper government closed the embassy in September of 2012. There's been no formal diplomatic relations with Iran since then, so that complicates the matter, as there are no officials on the ground like there would be in a country where we had an active embassy and an ongoing relationship. So what happened very early is the Global Affairs Rapid Response Team was deployed to go to the region. 10 consular officials who went to Ankara and Turkey to meet with the Iranian officials there to try to be issued visas so they could get into the country to provide consular services on the ground and help with things like body identification and repatriation to bring the remains of the family members back to Canada who want to have them brought back to Canada. And also 2 Transportation Safety Board officials have been deployed to Turkey as well. The latest information we have on that is, of those 12 officials, Iran has granted 2 visas. So there are still 10 more people they want to get into the country. There are indications that Iran may very well cooperate and allow that to happen, but it has been a slow process, obviously with the political maelstrom that has been surrounding this whole thing. So it has been one of the challenges already layered on top of a very difficult event. And also when you factor in the fact that the Americans, for example, have significant sanctions against Iran in place and required Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin to say earlier today that he would be willing to waive visa restrictions for people who could go in to help with this investigation. So the tense and really non-existent diplomatic relations that existed up to this plane going down was already a layer of complexity that they have been struggling to go through, while also comfort the families here at home and try to get them the answers and push for an investigation based on transparency, accountability, closure, as the Prime Minister says, and most importantly, justice.
All right, David Cochrane in Ottawa, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so in Ottawa, Washington, other capitals are monitoring Iran's crash investigation. Donald Trump is making new claims to explain his decision to kill Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. He says Iran was targeting multiple American embassies with large-scale attacks.
We will tell you that probably it was going to be the embassy in Baghdad. I can reveal that I believe it would have been 4 embassies.
Trump's comments on Fox News follow what he told reporters on Thursday, that America killed the Iranian commander last week because Iran was looking to blow up the embassy. Iran responded with a missile attack on U.S. troops stationed in Iraq, which today led Washington to impose a new round of sanctions.
We will continue to apply economic sanctions until Iran stops its terrorist activities and commit that it will never have nuclear weapons.
The new sanctions are in addition to those reinstated after the U.S. pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal. Some of the sectors targeted include Iran's manufacturing, mining, and textile sectors. So we're following major breaking news this hour. The National continues right after this.
What's going on?
Dish. All new episodes of Kim's Convenience.
Final answer.
I brought you something. Wow.
Jim, we already have.
I can return it. Maybe not now.
Beep, boop, beep, boop, pew, pew. Honk, honk.
I was a teacher back in Korea, but here people think I'm just a shopkeeper.
I know. People just see me as a cleaning lady.
Yeah, you're also good cook, good mommy.
And an excellent ultrasound technician.
Yeah.
Hello. You ever open up your fridge and go, there's nothing good in here? Well, it's time to celebrate saggy celery. It's time for Fridge Wars.
New series, February, on CBC and CBC Gem.
Well, in some ways, the story of Flight 752 has moved with astonishing speed and filled with surprises, and that happened again late tonight. A short time ago, the government of Iran accepted responsibility for shooting down the plane. A military statement read by state media a short while ago said that human error led them to mistake the aircraft for a hostile target launching a missile. As you know, everyone aboard, 176 people, died in the crash. Many of those passengers were Canadian and many more were headed to this country. And we've seen the memorials, in fact, this hour, seeing the memorials primarily at universities right across the country. So in terms of the headlines from this late development on this big story, the key ones are, as I just mentioned, Iran accepting responsibility, saying that its military did fire the missile, and saying that it was human error, that it was a mistake, and that they apologized for it. But at the same time, you heard earlier this hour the Iranian foreign minister blaming, at least in an implied way, maybe even in an explicit way, blaming the United States for raising the level of tension in the area, of beginning the hostilities with their drone strike, and suggesting that that was to blame for the high state of military readiness that the Iranian military was in. In such a condition, because of human error, this is from a statement from the military, and in an unintentional way, the flight was hit. According to the military, it did apologize. And here are a couple of interesting developments. They say they will upgrade their systems to prevent future tragedies. They also said those responsible for the strike on the plane would be prosecuted. You're watching a special edition of The National for this January 10th. Good night.